Here, my wife just sent me a text, said Jimmy Swaggart passed away. How old was he, Rhino?
90.
90 years old, man. Seemed like just yesterday he was on television with that fake crying and the lip quivering. I have sinned against you. Remember that?
88.
Was it 1988?
Yep.
Okay. Wow, man. Well, we're pleased to welcome Aaron Rice, founder and CEO of American Dream Legal. Aaron, it's been a while. Thanks for coming in.
It has been a while. Good to see you, Gerard. Thanks for having me.
So you got this new venture going on.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's like you said, it's named American Dream Legal, and basically what we do is defend the American dream in court. And so, really, it's interesting to me because the American dream is something that everybody used to agree on and believe in, but these days, a lot of people. I was researching this when we were naming it. I mean, if you look at online, 50% more people search for the American dream is dead than search for the American dream is alive. You've got books on the New York Times bestsellers list that claim the dream is a sham, and I saw just the other day that even Captain America, of all people, if you want to call him a person, came out in a comic book a couple years ago and said that the American dream was never really existed. And so there's this skepticism. Yeah, and so obviously I disagree strongly with that. I think there's a lot of confusion on what the dream actually is. But regardless, the positive side of it is that regular Americans aren't buying all that. It's 70% of Americans still believe the dream is real, and we do too. And so I don't think the dream is dead. We don't think the dream is dead, but we do think it's under attack and it has to be defended. And so that's what we do is represent everyday Americans when their rights are being trampled and things are happening that are keeping them from pursuing the American dream. And we represent them in court. And if we win, obviously it's great for them, but it also sets a precedent that protects the rights of everyone.
Okay. All right. Well, that's pretty cool. So do you have any cases that you're working on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. You may have seen just the other day we filed an appeal. And this actually, as you know, I've been doing this kind of legal work for years now. And so I was representing this group prior to the formation of American Dream, and now representing them at American Dream Legal. But we just filed an appeal for some pro-life doctors, and it's really an interesting situation. So what you have in Mississippi right now is, as everyone knows, once Roe v. Wade was overturned, we had a trigger law that went into effect in Mississippi that's declared that elective abortion in Mississippi was illegal. What a lot of people don't know is we also have a Mississippi Supreme Court opinion from 1998 that says elective abortion is a constitutional right in Mississippi under the Mississippi Constitution, not the U.S. Constitution. And so that's not affected by, the Dobbs decision. And so, a lot of people are actually kind of just willing to ignore that real direct conflict in the law there. But for our clients, they don't have the luxury of doing that. So their situation is that, they're pro-life doctors. They don't want to perform abortions or refer patients to have an abortion. But their board certification authority, which is this national organization, basically requires doctors who live in states where abortion is legal, even if they have conscience objections to it, it basically requires them to refer patients. So even if you're not going to perform the abortion, you have to bare minimum, refer the patient to someone else who will. And if you don't do that, it could jeopardize your board certification. And so for our physicians, they don't really have the luxury of just pretending like or ignoring the fact that Mississippi law is very unclear right now. And so we filed an appeal in that case, and what we're asking the Mississippi Supreme Court directly to clarify what the law is in Mississippi. Is elective abortion a crime or a constitutional right? Two totally different things. And of course, our position is that the Mississippi Constitution never protected the right to abortion. That Mississippi Supreme Court opinion from 1998 was wrongly decided, just like the Roe v. Wade case was at the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, we're seeking to do here on the state level essentially what was done on the national level with Dobbs, which is, really only fitting that we should do that and have that happen here because, as you know, it was a Mississippi law that was challenged all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in the Dobbs case and wound up overturning Roe. So it really only makes sense that here in Mississippi we go ahead and put an end to our state courts doing the same thing and having these precedents that say, basically impose abortion policy by judicial fiat instead of letting our policymakers do it.
I've seen reports, Aaron, of physicians and healthcare providers in Texas, which also has very restrictive abortion laws, where they're concerned about even providing basic medical care to pregnant women on the grounds that they may face some sort of legal consequences from the state, right?
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about those two? I think that I mentioned earlier this board certification authority for OBGYNs. And I honestly think a lot of that confusion that you hear about, there's the confusion we have in Mississippi, which is different, which is fundamentally what is the law? Is abortion a crime or a constitutional right? It's just bare basics here. But when you get past that and you have physicians talking about, well, I don't know if I can, treat this patient or if this will count as, as a crime, if their life is in danger, what does that mean and all of that? I actually think a lot of that confusion stems from these same national organizations that I've mentioned that are putting pressure on our clients, these pro-life physicians. And essentially what I mean by that is that it's really kind of their job to educate, these OBGYNs around the nation about, what the laws are, what they mean, and all of that. And
well,
they really
new territory.
Exactly. It is. And so, but to make it worse, these national groups who are very, pro-abortion, they kind of refuse to help with that. And so you have physicians who may have those questions, like you said, and there may be a very clear answer to that question that could be, their board certification authority and their kind of national physician group could be helping them with that. And instead, they would rather not help with that and keep that confusion around so that they can, use it as something to blame on these, abortion bans and say, look at all the confusion they create. And it's you go, well, in any other situation, you would be helping clarify that confusion, but you won't do it here.
Yeah. Got it. Well, interesting for sure how this is maybe sort of opened up lots of different legal issues as a result, right?
It has, absolutely. There's, you hear it referred to a lot of times as the post-Dobbs world. And just like anything, when you have a sea change in the law that, Dobbs, changed 49 years of U.S. Supreme Court precedent. And, there's been a lot of things that have been, built around that. And so once that is wiped away, you certainly do have, I remember, for example, in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, there would be a lot of questions surrounding, well, can states that do outlaw it, do they have authority for people that travel beyond their borders, or, can the federal government pass, a federal statute that prohibits abortion in all the states? And as you and I have talked about before, we are both in favor of, leaving this at the state level. That's one of the great things about federalism is letting the states decide it. And I think that was part of the Dobbs decision was, recognizing, the benefits of federalism. And so, but yeah, there's certainly a lot of questions that pop up.
Okay. So the name of the organization, American Dream Legal. Yep. So where do you see kind of the future of your cases do they relate to this American Dream?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of put them into three different buckets. And it's the, in my mind, the things that are the main components of the American Dream that I mentioned earlier. And so one of those is the pursuit of happiness is what we call it. And that's basically, your freedom to choose to chase your dreams. And usually that's going to involve, and primarily that involves, the occupation of your choice and being able to do that. That's really the heart of the American Dream is to build a better life for yourself through hard work. And so, y'all talked about certificate of need with your past guests briefly. Mm-hmm. We're representing a client right now who's got a challenge to some of Mississippi's certificate of need laws. But there's a lot of instances outside of CON, with occupational licensing or all kind of other places where you've basically got crony capitalism is what you've got. It should be very easy to go open a business. You shouldn't have to curry favor with regulators to do it. But instead, entrenched incumbents have used connections in the government to shut competition out. And so we're very opposed to that. We think that, undermines the American dream. And so we represent, people who want to challenge things like that happen to them. Another component of the dream is equality of opportunity. And so, it used to be that civil rights leaders fought for all of us to be treated equally before the law. But as you're very aware, today with this kind of obsession with group identity, today you've got actual governments that are discriminating against people and denying them opportunities that the American dream should leave open to them based on, immutable characteristics like their race or their sex or other labels that are put out there. And so we want to, put a stop to that as well, because we think that undermines the American dream. And lastly, kind of just the bedrock of the American dream is individual liberty. And that's, your freedoms that are essential to American life, recognized in our Constitution. And a lot of them are under attack, whether that's, the right to free speech or self-defense or parental rights, all kind of things like that. And so we want to defend people's individual rights as well.
Hang around if you can. We'll keep
absolutely.
talking. We got Aaron Rice, founder and CEO of American Dream Legal, in the Element Wealth studio. Aaron Rice, founder and CEO of American Dream Legal. So, Aaron, this just sounds like kind of an extension of a lot of the work you were doing in the past, right?
Absolutely. So, I mentioned earlier, as you know, I've been doing this this kind of constitutional litigation since 2018. And so I was doing that at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, and, saw an opportunity here and a need here to go out and start my own public interest law firm that does that. And, really, it's nothing against MCPP or anything. There's certain things that, when you're doing it with a public policy organization, obviously it needs to be, the cases you're doing need to be very closely tied to the policy goals of the organization. And kind of, there's a lot of areas for legal reform that are needed that don't necessarily tie to an immediate public policy benefit. So, for example, you probably remember a year or two ago, the U.S. Supreme Court had a big case where they overruled something called Chevron deference, if you remember that. Yeah. And so that's an example of something where, legal reform is needed. That was a terrible precedent and jurisprudence of the court to do that. Basically, for the listeners, it meant that, if you challenged a government agency in court that was doing something and you said, look, the law does not allow the agency to do that, and the agency said, yes, this law passed by Congress does allow us to do it, then when it got to the courts would defer to the agency. And, that's fundamentally wrong, because it's fundamentally the job of the courts to interpret the law and say what the law means. But for years and years, the Supreme Court had this doctrine that said that the courts will defer to, government agencies and their interpretation of what the law allows them to do. And so obviously that spawns all kind of public policy problems. But, if you're working on that, that's not tied to an immediate public policy issue, that might be, a priority of a think tank or something like that. Yeah. And so, there's a lot of opportunities like that where there's broader legal reform that needs to occur. And so, this is really, like you said, an extension of work that I have personally been doing for years, but on a broader scale. And I think that it will kind of widen our opportunities for things we can do.
Something that you and I have both advocated for is just some common sense reforms to occupational licensing,
Absolutely.
Which are overbearing in our state. For a red state, it seems like we lean in the wrong direction on that one.
Absolutely, and that's it's interesting that you say that, because that's one of the most interesting to me, is that we are a very red state, but when you look at issues like occupational licensing, in Mississippi, I mean, I don't want to necessarily say we're one of the worst, but we're certainly not one of the best. And I think it's there's a lot of issues like that where the interest of, I mentioned earlier, entrenched players are so pronounced, and they will push so hard to get what they want at the legislature, whether what they want is really constitutional or not, that, it's one of those things where, despite being, a red state where you would expect us to have a much higher regard for individual liberty and the American dream, like we've been talking about, you nevertheless, when you go through the Mississippi Code, find all these examples of carve-outs or benefits and favors. Protectionism.
Cronied up through the
Exactly,
years.
Absolutely cronied up. And so there's a lot of that. And, I have personally done a lot of cases like that. We had an eyebrow threader, Deepa Bhattacharya was her name, that I represented. And got her to be able to open up, her, and she's doing great, by the way, today. I mean, she, was just trying to, do one salon at the time that did this eyebrow threading, and, she won her case, and today, she's got multiple locations opened up throughout Mississippi. I want to say it's 5 and counting. and she inked a deal with Walmart where she's eligible to open salons in, actual Walmart locations, which I think she has already done or is in the process of doing. And so she is just, thriving, living her American dream, which again, just like you said, that's exactly what we want. Mm-hmm. And I've done that again. I've had cases representing, all kind of people, whether they were in telemedicine or other cosmetology related industries, all kind of things where you had these anti-competitive laws, and I've challenged those and will continue to challenge those at American Dream Legal.
Well, and there's some other areas of protectionism as well that unfortunately exist in our state, and I've been known to say in the past that we're all about free markets in Mississippi, except when it comes to education and health care and occupational licensing and vehicle sales and sports betting. Other than that, we're all about it, right?
And where you see that a lot, too, is on the individual level. You'll see a lot of people that are, I'm all for, individual liberty or free markets, except for when it comes to my business. And there's always a special reason. There's always a special reason why, it doesn't really work in my industry.
Everybody's got a sacred cow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's how we arguably ended up in $37 trillion of debt.
That's right. That's right.
I can't cut that, right?
Yeah.
But that's okay.
I'm in general, I'm in favor of all of this. We need to cut spending, but not this one that helps me.
Well, so are you going to be working with lawmakers in any regard to maybe try to shape some legislation?
It's interesting. So we actually did get approval, and that's one of the things that has been going on behind the scenes in forming American Dream Legal. It's a major task to do that, and so we have approval from the IRS to operate as a 501c3. And we actually did go ahead and get approval to do that, what you're saying, to essentially lobby the legislature so that, when there's issues that we're working on in the courts, but we, think, hey, this could be handled through legislation that would preempt a lot of these problems or things like that. And so we have the approval to do it. We're not going to be doing it in the, immediate future. And I say that just because, as you know, I mean, we're a startup and we're getting rolling here. And so the main priority is definitely litigation right now, and that's what we're completely focused on. And as you know, too, we've got, thankfully, some great groups here in Mississippi, like Empower and the Mississippi Center for Public Policy and other groups who are doing that kind of work. And so I think for the time being, what you'll see us do more of is work with those groups. And, they may see a problem that, really only can be fixed with a litigation solution, and they may, highlight that problem to us and see if we can help with it, or they may refer a client to us. And then, conversely, we may see problems through our litigation that really need a legislative solution, and we may go talk to them and say, hey, this is something we're seeing. Do y'all think y'all could sponsor and push some legislation on this? But again, down the road, I think it'd be the same thing as with founding American Dream Legal. If we see things that are kind of purely legal reform that's needed, but needed, through the legislature, and that we're uniquely positioned to be the voice on, then I could see us expanding down the road and doing a little bit of that.
You talked about the Chevron deference was absolutely a landmark decision by the Supreme Court. It had been going on too long. It just feels like, Aaron, that we're more at risk of our rights being violated and certainly contradicting or conflicting with federalism, with policies and regulations issued by non-elected bureaucrats in the agencies in the federal government than we are the people who get elected to make the laws.
Absolutely, and that you're exactly right about that. It's a huge issue, and it really comes back to these kind of fundamental constitutional issues that we work on. But one of those is the separation of powers, and the way this is supposed to work is that Congress is supposed to legislate and the executive is supposed to enforce and all of that. But as you know, what we've had over decades and decades now is the whether it's state legislatures or Congress, doing less of that and farming more and more authority out to these bureaucrats and just saying, they'll kind of have a bill that says, we need to tackle this problem, we create this agency, y'all go handle it. Yeah. And so you've delegated a lot of authority to these, nameless, faceless bureaucrats who, are not held accountable by the people because they don't have to run for election, And if what they're doing is unpopular, there's no mechanism to really get them out of office or stop them from doing it.
Right.
And that's, again, where American Dream Legal comes in, is because your average American really doesn't have any levers to pull there and really anything they can do. That's where we can come in and say, well, maybe you can't vote these people out of office, or maybe, other things like that you could normally do, but we'll represent you for free, and we'll try to put a stop to it.
Well, I just feel like, honestly, and so I'm glad your organization recognizes this and is focused on this, that it seems like we're in full-time mode of having to stand in the gap
Absolutely.
to prevent the federal overreach down to the state and individual level.
Absolutely. And I do think, again, it goes back to what we were talking about, Congress just farming all this out. And then you also have, executives in either party who see that gap and say, well, I'm going to fill it and I'm going to do whatever I want.
Yeah. Aaron, appreciate you coming on.
Yeah,
Good
absolutely.
luck. Yeah,
thanks so much,
like
Gerard.
a great deal. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Aaron Rice, founder and CEO of American Dream Legal, has been our guest in the Element Wealth studio.